just give me a thumbs up if people can see the screen that I just shared. Okay, great news. So welcome, thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to talk about fake news, specifically how we can help our students find credible news sources. This is me, I'm Dr. Jennifer Tole, and I'm from Rowan University. So a little bit about me. Hopefully I'm still recognizable from my faculty portrait that was taken pre-pandemic and pre-having 2 children. But I teach at Rowan University and in the writing arts department. I teach students in first year writing sometimes, but my main focus is in technical and professional writing, where we talk a lot about kind of writing that students do in different workplaces. In all of my classes, though, one of the things that's most important is the idea of information literacy, which is how we locate, evaluate, and use information that we find. A lot of what I talk about with students now has to do with the credibility and authority of online sources. As we all know, we live in a kind of ever-changing digital landscape. So in this particular presentation, we're going to talk about news literacy, which is the ability to find, evaluate, and use, act on things that we find in the news, which is something that, as I said, as I talk with my own students about, but that we can think about the special or the even the more kind of challenging ways that this impacts our literacy students, right? Our English language learners. So here's our agenda, or what we'll talk about today. First, we'll talk a little bit about what fake news is. It's a term that's gained a lot of currency lately, and it can be used in different ways. So we'll kind of specify what are some examples of fake news? What does this look like? Because, studies show that most people wildly overestimate their ability to pick out fake news. So we'll take a look at some more insidious examples and try to see where we can start to notice, fact from fiction. We'll think about why it matters to our students. As I said just a moment ago, this is challenging for native English speakers. This is challenging for people who identify as, digital natives. A study that was done at Stanford just a couple of years ago found that over 80% of middle school students were totally duped by fake news. And the number was lower, a lower percentage in high school students, but still that even to people, like digital natives who are used to getting their information online, this can be really challenging. So what would this mean then for non-native English speakers? What does this mean for people who don't have regular access to or experience with, the digital landscape, with finding their news online? And one last thing I'll just say about this too, when I gave this talk 2 years ago in 2019 at this same conference, which was in person. And so much has happened since then, right? And it strikes me now over the last year and a half, especially, or a year, I guess, especially, so much has happened between a presidential election, between, a global pandemic that's unprecedented for all of us, racial tensions, so much is happening in the world around us, and there's so much misinformation, and there's so much ease of access to this misinformation and sharing of it, that to me, this issue of helping people discern what is real and what's meant to deceive them is ever more important. I can't think, it seems so much more, it seemed urgent to me in 2019, and now it seems like in some ways a kind of life or death thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And finally, we'll work together, and I'll share some activities, and we can brainstorm some additional ones together to think through what we can do with our students to help them navigate fake news in their own lives. Okay, so I thought we could start by looking at some examples of what fake news looks like, so that we can sort of understand how it has its effect on people. So here's a headline, and this is a screenshot that says, NASA admits that climate change occurs because of changes in Earth's solar orbit, and not because of SUVs and fossil fuels. And this looks like a typical lead for a news story, right? We have a date, we have an author, we have some tags, and they all seem pretty, related to the topic. I've linked this out so we can look at the actual article. It's loading. Slowly. Okay. So here's the article. And I want us to imagine, now this is pretty, this is a big deal, right? If NASA comes out and says that basically this is challenging the idea of global warming as we know it, right? We're challenging the idea that humans' activity, that our use of fossil fuels, that science has been telling us now for a long time is responsible for climate change and global warming. This article is challenging that, right, and saying that that's not true. So let me ask you this. What about this article looks like you can trust it? I'm just kind of scrolling down here. And we see here that they're saying that NASA says that the changes in our weather are completely natural and normal. And then the story goes on to say, I know it's kind of hard to read as I'm scrolling down, but basically what they're quoting this astrophysicist who has this climate theory and basically just says that climate change is a natural byproduct. There's my dog as promised. A natural byproduct of the Earth's orbit. And we have some figures here. And they are showing us kind of like what look like scientific figures. As I noted a moment ago, we're referencing scientists and astrophysicists here. So let me ask you this. What about the article? I'm wondering if I should let this dog out really quickly so he gives us a moment. Let me do that. Excuse me for one moment while I let out my pup. And then as I'm kind of doing that, maybe you can think about what about this article looks legitimate, looks real. Okay, can anybody share any ideas?
Well, the fact that it has dates in it might give some credibility to the story. I find a lot of things that set off little bells in my head, though, that it's not. So it's hard to see something that is.
It's just, I agree. It looks, literally looks like a legitimate article.
Yes.
But when you read it, it loses its luster, but it looks right.
Absolutely, right? Thank you both. So yeah, like we kind of know, at first glance, this looks like a legitimate news article. As you guys mentioned, just the presence of like any kind of numbers or data linking to things always makes it seem really credible, right? Because it's like referencing other sources, but they're really referencing themselves here, right? Because if you click on this, this goes to, I believe this goes to another article by the same, let me see, maybe that one's different, but a lot of times in this, and there's a kind of an unfairness here in that I know what natural news is, but if you didn't, it says defending health, life, and liberty. So you're like, okay, that seems pretty innocuous, right? Nothing totally strange there. They have some other articles here. So you might start to look around. Climate change hopes collapses as new science finds human activity has virtually zero impact. And then you sort of look at these kind of what's happening over here in these headlines, again, that look pretty legitimate, but you might start to kind of question like, wow, that's a pretty, that's a pretty big claim. And then as you start to read the article though, as someone pointed out, you start to see things that maybe, are a little bit dubious or are a little bit untrue. Does anybody know anything about natural news?
No.
Yeah, and there, it was not, I didn't really know too much about it either, but if you, let me see, bottom here probably tells us they're about us. They're basically one of the most widely known, although not widely known to me, kind of conspiracy theory, very kind of just false, right, information. And what they'll tell you on their about page is that they're a science-based natural health advocacy organization. They're empowering consumers And as you start to read down, you can sort of see what they're interested in. And most of this sounds pretty good, right? Holistic health, spirituality. They also warn readers about science gone bad and frequently cites examples of science resulting in catastrophe caused crimes against humanity. Here's what's interesting about the article that we just looked at. Over 4.2 million people engaged with this article. And the link here, this is Brandwatch, which is a kind of fact-checking organization who, you know, double checks and fact checks information. This is the #1 engaged article that talks about kind of denying climate change in this way. 4.2 million people have engaged with it, meaning they clicked on it, shared it, etc. If you were to investigate this further, and towards later on in the slides, I'll show you some places where you yourself can go anytime you're not sure about something you see in the news. And Snopes is one of my favorite fact-checking places, fact-checking websites. And this is absolutely false. And you can, I've linked here the Snopes Verdict so you can check it out yourself, but basically they explain, you know, they break down all of the logic or all of the quote data that's shared in that natural news article, and they tell you why this is false. And, you know, we don't have the time to do so right now, but it kind of breaks down all of that for you, and that's one of the resources you can always use, Snopes, to figure out whether or not something is true. But the point is 4.2 million people have clicked on, shared, otherwise engaged with this article, you know, that comes from a seemingly legitimate news source that is not based in science, in fact. Here's another example. So this is an infographic. Somebody tell us, what's the story being told in this infographic?
Black people are likely to kill black people. That's the real problem.
Yes. And how do you know that how is that indicated in this infographic?
Well, it's red.
Yes. Right. So the way that the numbers are set up, we have kind of at the bottom in red, blacks killed by blacks. It's obviously 97% is the huge outlying number. It's in red. Anything else about this that's sort of meant to tell you that story?
The man looks like he's in a black action movie. He's holding his gun like a villain, not like a policeman or a superhero.
Yeah, exactly, right? The choice of the picture here, right, coupled with these statistics is absolutely telling the story that you just picked up on, which is that the problem is, right, and we have the crime statistics as our kind of headline. The problem with crime is clearly Black people killing Black people. And this is reinforced not only by the quote data, but the visual representation of it, right? That blacks, and also highlighted is that blacks killed by police is at 1%, right? So that your eyes are kind of drawn to those two things. So the problem then, the story this infographic is telling us is not, the problem is not that Black people are killed by police, but the problem is that 97% of the time it's Black people killing other Black people. And this just so happens to be coupled with, as you point out, an image of a Black man, holding a gun, looking, as you said, like a criminal and not like, a positive figure in any way.
And the hidden message is interesting because it's half of Black people killed by whites are killed by white policemen.
Right, interesting. Yes.
There's also a really subtle message, I think, in the colors.
Yes.
Blue for the police is a very political statement, and red is typically a color of danger. And so
yes.
those are kind of subtle cues about how we should feel.
Absolutely. And, I would argue they're like subtle and also not subtle, right? I mean, it's kind of, it's very strategic, right?
They've put the source as the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco to lend credibility to these numbers, while it is a case of misrepresentation of statistics.
Yes. And I love that you pointed out the source, because as we'll find out in just a second, the Crime Statistics Bureau is not a real thing. It does not exist. So here's the problem with this infographic. This infographic became so viral that it was actually tweeted by then President Trump on Sunday, November 22nd, 2015. And Donald Trump shared this exact infographic with the, and this is not a political statement, by the way, I'm just we're talking through how misinformation can spread and the impact it can have. Now we have, the President of the United States sharing this information, using the statistics to show that Blacks kill 91% of white homicide victims, which wasn't even what we were talking about. We didn't even discuss the whites killed by Blacks line here, which says, as the president tweeted, 81%. So this is how viral this infographic became. Here's the problem, though. One, as we already noted, the image is meant to provoke fear. It feeds into a racist narrative of violent young Black men. If we actually look at the real data and we take proportions into account, it's actually true that Black Americans are 2.5 more likely to be killed by police than whites. And actually, statistics that are available in that same year from the FBI demonstrate that the numbers were actually totally flipped. 81% of whites are killed by whites, and 16% of whites are killed by Blacks. It's kind of a statistical fact that's been around for a very long time, that most white people are killed by white people and most Black people are killed by Black people. So the data itself is actually distorted and falsified. And finally, as I noted just a moment ago, there's no such entity as the Crime Statistics Bureau. So this infographic is a really great, and I mean great, not that it's a good thing, but it's like a prime example of how people can manipulate and purposely falsify information in order to feed a narrative, right? To fit their agenda. And, I'm showing you that the President of the United States retweeted this same infographic to highlight how dangerous this is, right? When we have people in high offices, no matter what their political party, when we have people who are in power sharing and disseminating false information that incites fear and incites violence, this is really problematic. Finally, I wanted to find one that feeds into or that is related to the pandemic that we find ourselves in now. So this one is called Coronavirus Bioweapon: How China Stole Coronavirus from Canada and Weaponized it. And I'll click on the link here so you can see the article in full. To me, what is so insidious about this one is how legitimate it looks. I don't know how many people do a lot of reading in scholarly journals or anything like that, but this, it comes from something called the Journal on Geopolitics and International Relations, which sounds like, a really, this sounds like a legitimate thing, right? This sounds like a scholarly journal that you might find. We have our headline here. We see that it comes from Great Game India. And as you start to scroll down, is there anything that strikes you as not something you wouldn't expect to see in a scholarly journal?
All of those ads.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? So absolutely. And even though, so the presence of ads can be a kind of tricky thing, because we never want to, there can be legitimate news sources that still use advertisements, but this one's sort of, on the face really seeming to be a kind of scholarly journal. But we know that if we were looking at a real scholarly journal, there wouldn't be so many ads all over the place. And there's a lot here, right? And we can see the gist of the article that last year, a mysterious shipment was caught smuggling coronavirus from Canada. It was traced to Chinese agents working in a Canadian lab. And they say that this is part of a biological warfare program. The findings have been corroborated by none other than the bioweapons expert, Dr. Francis Boyle. And there's a clip to him so you can learn more about him. Here's something else that makes it look really legitimate. This looks like a Wikipedia menu, right? When you click on a Wikipedia page, which we know is a mostly credible source, there's usually a kind of, table of contents, right, or sort of menu where that you can click down. And so they give us, and there's this data, right? We have dates, we have people's names that are, that are doctors, right? So what's so, troubling about this example is, to me, is how much it looks legitimate, how much this mimics strategically what a scholarly journal, what a medical scientific journal might look like. If you do a little digging around, though, you'll find out that what was his name again? This bioweapons expert, Dr. Francis Boyle, is a sort of known conspiracy theorist who has held, prominent positions, but is quite, explicitly has an agenda. And if you look into this Great Game India, or what was it? Great Game India. What you'll find is that it's also a conspiracy theory. It's one person who started this kind of conspiracy theory website journal, as they call it, and they put out these publications. So this is really dangerous, right? Because it's not based in actual fact. It's based on conspiracy theories. I'll show you one more related example because I think it even more shows why this is important in terms of decisions people make. So this one, the headline reads, "Vaccines containing mercury are, quote, medical genocide that target Black communities to damage their babies." And we have a kind of picture here. We have, to me, this already looks suspicious. And if you click on it, you'll see it takes us to our old friend Natural News, which we already know now is not a legitimate news source. But on face value, before you read anything, again, this looks legit, right? This looks like a news website. But then as you start to read, it becomes pretty obvious that, the names here, that vaccine truth activists, Robert F. Kennedy and Robert De Niro, like this seems really strange, right? That, these people are being used. If you look at what they're quoting themselves as a legitimate source, which, should raise some red flags. But there's a lot of stuff here that looks legitimate, right? It's giving us some data, some facts. This to me, misinformation, and this is not true, by the way. These are, if you look this up on Snopes or any of the fact-checking things, it's completely, not based in fact. There's not science behind it. But the problem is, in this particular case, we have 18,000 people viewing it, which might not seem like a lot. But the problem is, we're in the middle of a global pandemic where our reliance on public health institutions to give us guidelines and provide safe, safe suggestions is really important. So we need to help readers understand which sites they can trust and which to be cautious about. It's a matter of public health. And this is an older article that about vaccines that came out before the pandemic. But in thinking about this, it just struck me as, there's so much misinformation, and this, I'm not making an argument for or against vaccines here, but my point is that people are making, not to be dramatic, but people are making life or death decisions, right? Based on what they read in the news. So it's our, responsibility, or, we need to help students try to navigate this really tricky and insidious landscape where there is so much misinformation that's very purposely packaged and made to look real. If people are making decisions about these things that aren't based in fact and aren't based in science, then they're potentially making really bad decisions that, and in the case of the pandemic, for instance, not only affect individual people and their families, but become a public health issue, right? If there's enough misinformation about how the virus spreads and all that kind of stuff, it's harmful to all of us in our communities. Okay, oops, I think it's
Can I just ask one quick question?
Absolutely, yes.
So often I see on Facebook news feeds, which is where our students get a lot of their news and information.
Yes.
There's this information that says mercury is going to kill your baby. And so then there'll be comment. And then someone will comment with a link to an article like that.
Yes.
And it's, I forget to sometimes tell my students, you need to check it all out, not just the original, the original meme, but also the rest of it.
Oh yeah, that's a great point, Marcia. Thank you for sharing. And that's what I'm trying to move a little bit quickly in the interest of time, but that's what I was trying to show you, that a lot of times that this fake news or these just kind of falsified claims, they will look like they have real links, right? But oftentimes if you follow the trail as you're suggesting, what you'll find is that it doesn't lead to, a legitimate place. So yeah, that's something we'll talk about too, is like, how can we help students to see, that we can't, really to think critically and to really read critically, everything that they see. And you're absolutely right. One of the things that we'll talk about when we kind of think about what is fake news, but it's been around for a long time. But there's, I just learned this, but I thought it was super interesting. Benjamin Franklin, right? Founding father Benjamin Franklin, and he's got a whole list of interesting things that he did in his life. But he created a fake newspaper article alleging that Native Americans had scalped 700 boys and girls and babies and mailed the scalps back to England because he was angry that a bunch of Native American soldiers aided the British in the Revolution, and he wanted to incite hatred and mistrust of the Native Americans. So we're talking all the way back at the beginning of our country, right? I always remember learning yellow journalism in grade school social studies, but the idea, in the 19th century, that there were just falsified stories, right? Propaganda that were meant to drum up support for the Spanish Civil War. And those two examples, though old, right, are examples of times when like there was actual journalism, right, with like ethical standards and editors and all that kind of stuff. The kind of news that Marcia's talking about and that ourselves and our students get information from can be created by virtually anyone, right? It's not coming from journalists. And not to say that journalists are sort of like, my point is that, even journalists make mistakes, but now we have such access to information. Virtually anyone can create content and disseminate it in so many different ways. So it's something we have to be really mindful of, right? That the average person, with an email address can, create content and make it look real and share and disseminate it.
May I ask then whether by fake news you mean it's not created by a legitimate news organization, or do you mean that it's not true? What's the fake in fake news?
That's a great question, Peggy. And I was actually, well, we can come back to this for a second, but I was going to ask everyone like their interpretation of what fake news is, because there are actual scholars, I'm not one of them, who study fake news like as a discipline. Because there's fake news that's satire, right? Like The Onion or something that's meant to be funny. There's fake news that's biased, meaning it's information that is not necessarily false, but is packaged in such a way to fit a certain agenda. The fake news that so do other people have kind of thoughts about what that could mean, fake news?
I think of it as news that is created from whole cloth to fit an agenda.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's not of whole cloth. The example you used, where Robert Kennedy was used in the article that said there's mercury in vaccines, he is an anti-vaxxer. And so whether he said that or whether he even knows they put his name in is something else. But that's using his name in a way I'm not sure he would approve of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated, and there are different, as I was saying, there's kind of like different levels where we can think about kind of false news. I borrowed this definition from the New York Times, who said, narrowly defined, it's a made-up story with an intention to deceive, often geared towards getting clicks. So I think whether we think of it as completely falsified or as partially falsified, the point is that it's presented as news, presented as fact, though it's knowingly deceitful, right? And the point is to fit a certain agenda or to get people to engage.
Jen,
Yeah.
Why is the ultimate goal often geared toward getting clicks? Isn't the point of clicks to spread the deceit?
Yes.
So I'm not sure why often geared toward getting clicks is part of the fake
I think
news goal.
what they meant, so if you look at some of the headlines that we looked at,
Mhm.
the idea is to like get people to engage, right? To sort of that like wow factor, that shock factor of getting people to click on something.
Oh, so to share in the deceit?
Well,
Yeah.
it's the algorithms are such that the more people click on something, the more often that will be presented to the next person who Googles the basic idea.
Okay, so they're relying on their readers to spread their disinformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the more the fake news spreads, the more it looks like real news.
Yeah.
The more it gets quoted elsewhere, Facebook, Twitter, so.
Yeah, it gets normalized.
Mhm.
Yes.
And there are some people who just want the popularity. I mean, we see it in lesser subjects, especially among the young. But look how many clicks I got. That's look here. How many people like me or think I'm smart or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Really good points. Yeah, and thanks, Peggy, for bringing up that. Yeah, like the more, and all of you guys are kind of saying the same thing, that the more the fake news gets attention, right, the less fake it looks, and the more it becomes mainstream. Like literally, right? It becomes the and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But well, let me ask you this question first before we get there. Have you ever been duped by fake news or known someone who's been duped by fake news that you're willing to share?
Yes. Yeah. The news about Mr. Rogers being a SEAL, that wasn't true. I believed it. I thought he was a Navy SEAL. That was fake.
So, and what's like, that one might seem like a little bit kind of harmless, right? Like, why
Right.
is it, there were a couple examples I came across when I was putting this together for you guys that were, one was about how eating Reese's cups, like gives you cancer or something like that. And, that would be terrible because I love Reese's cups, but doesn't seem to necessarily fit like a political agenda. But yeah, it doesn't always have to be sort of big stakes issues, right?
Right.
It can be the smaller things that are just, and like you guys were pointing out, like people, we live in a culture where getting those clicks or getting that popularity, being the first to know something, being the first to like share news on Facebook, even if it's, not true, seems to be like a mark of something, right? Pride, being in the know, right? Or knowing something other people don't know and sharing that news. Yeah, so unfortunately, Mr. Rogers is a lot of things, but not a Navy SEAL. Anything else?
Right.
Well, the other thing that is so popular now is medical information. And I had a health literacy class with students, and their first assignment was, please go out and research any medical condition you care to. And I had a student who came back with all sorts of printed research about something called blue waffles. And I won't go into detail on what that was, but it was really disgusting. And so I said, well, let's start looking through your sources. And it was, I mean, they were totally believing there was blue waffles. And the sources were just made up. The grammar was wrong. The punctuation was wrong. There were spelling errors. All those things we look for that, students just don't know.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's not great that happened, but that's an
That
example.
was pretty cool. We laughed about it for a long time after.
Well, that kind of brings me to my second question, and feel free to answer either of them. But has a student ever come to you either with questions about the legitimacy of something that they're reading in the news, or as Marcia points out, kind of this quote research on something that the student was unable to decipher as real or not?
My student has come to me with the opposite. She works for the Epoch Times, which is an extremely slanted newspaper based in New York, but a Chinese newspaper. And I don't know how to answer her without saying, why are you working for those people?
Wow, that's super interesting, Peggy. Yeah, so she's sort of unaware of the bias
Right,
the
she,
agenda that
she believes in completely in what they're saying.
wow. Anybody have anything similar or kind of,
I have a student who, I mean, he's limited, but still he believes everything he reads or everything he tells or anyone will tell him. And he's got it so wrong, the whole picture of what goes on in this country, anything. And I mean, he just doesn't answer if I try to gently suggest something else. And he's not going to change his mind. It's really very sad.
yeah, that is sad, Gail. And as both you and Peggy were talking, I was thinking about, you know, for me, what it's like to have like people in your family, right, or close friends, especially during the election, for instance, where divides, you know, on points of view became so, you know, far apart, and people became and still are really so entrenched in a certain way of seeing things on both sides, right, on all sides, that it becomes really, really difficult to find any common ground. And that's kind of one of the problems that I want to talk, you know, and get your opinions about it as well. You know, the problem with fake news is that because there's so much information out there, people can literally cherry pick, right? If I have a stance that I want, you know, people to believe in, I can find an article that says what I want to say, and I can post it somewhere, and I can get people to, you know, the way it's such a, I hate the expression double-edged sword because it's so cliched, but I can't think of a better one. That's why it's a cliche, right? But, you know, we have so much access to information. We read so much more than any generation, right? We're able to know, quote, know so much. But that very same luxury, right, is our curse, because there's so much out there that people are able to, you know, whatever you believe or whatever you can just look at that, right? You can ignore all the other stuff and you can just go to that, you know, one newspaper or that one news site, or you can, you know, just have on your news feed what can, you know, what confirms what you believe. So I was thinking about, as you were talking, you know, how do we, this is a real question for us to think about, that I wish I had an answer to, but I don't think it's that simple. You know, how do we talk with people, with our students, and try to, without, you know, while respecting their beliefs and while respecting their own personal authority, right, to make decisions and to you know, we don't need to tell them what to think. That's not our jobs. But our jobs, or what we want to do, what we want to be for our students, we want to advocate for them, right? We want to support them. We want to present them with the opportunity, right, to question things and to think critically. So how can we get our students to think critically without disrespecting them or making judgments for them, right? Because just because I think something's not true, right? Like just because I like vaccines doesn't mean that everyone has to necessarily, right? But I want to be able to give my students the critical thinking skills to be able to figure that out for themselves. And whether they're reading something that's pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, that they're able to sort of at least be able to tell if there's an agenda, right? At least they can be able to start to discern things on their own. So it's definitely a fine line between respecting someone's viewpoint and respecting their own authority to make decisions, but also guiding them and kind of showing them, you know, what's behind the news that we look at. Yeah, really hard questions.
In my class, we often talk about whether a news source or an article is trustworthy, not based on the content or the position at all, but by the appearance of it. You know, a lot of things in quotation marks, a lot of things in uppercase or bold or crazy colors. So we don't ever get to whether the information is right or wrong, but these are flags that sometimes persuasive pieces that are not based entirely on known facts present themselves.
I think that's great, Amy, and kind of related to what I was saying, in some ways the content is immaterial, right? Because like I said, we're not trying to sway them to think one thing or the other. We're just trying to show them how it works, right? Like the mechanisms here, that how is this put together and why? And from there, right, once they can kind of discern how it's put together and why, then they can sort of evaluate it on their own. And that's the point, right? That's the point, is for them to be able to evaluate it. But how can someone evaluate and think critically about something when they're being duped, right? When they're being fooled?
I wonder whether there's any way that this could be connected to telling whether a phone call is fraudulent. What do you hear that makes you think maybe not? It's the same kind of thing, picking up on fake something.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's a way I think that you could start a conversation with a student, right? It's funny you mentioned that, Gail, because I remember, I think that this, and I don't know, I don't want to make a generalization, but I've heard other English language learners say before that they've been tricked by fake phone calls and fake mailers put in their, in their mailbox that say, like, you've won $25,000. Just send us your social security number and all of your, relevant information. But yes, that idea of, it's not that people, right. So sort of the similar thing, if we take the news aspect out of it and we approach it as, sometimes people, try to get over on you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's keep going. But this is a question that we're going to kind of keep wrestling with, I think. So we kind of talked a little bit about this, what I'm talking about in terms of fake news, but really what we mean here is not mistakes, that happen, or not satire. We're talking about news that's intentionally meant to deceive people in order to fit some kind of agenda. So why does this matter? And I wanted to think about this kind of in broad strokes, like for all of us, and then get a little bit more specific about how this might be particularly challenging for our students. And one thing, so this is related to the 2016 election. And what I think is most relevant here is that the top 20 election stories in the months, I guess weeks, months, leading up to the election were fake. That of the top 20 stories that were circulating on Facebook, 8.7 million of them were not true. And you can see some of them here. 960,000 people engaging with this story about Pope Francis endorsing Donald Trump. This one, almost 800,000 people about Hillary selling weapons to ISIS. But what's so shocking to me, and Statistica is a pretty reliable, again, kind of like fact-checking analytics site, that more people, the top 20 stories that people were, posting and sharing and commenting on and reading leading up to the election, but the majority of them were not true. And by not true, I mean intentionally created to deceive people and sway their opinions. There's a couple of really good documentaries out right now on Netflix and HBO about all of this kind of stuff that are super troubling and terrifying. But more closely in the last election, and this is not, again, a political statement, but I thought that this was super interesting. Here's an article out of the BBC that this is actually the case of how an actual mistake in the Michigan voting maps, and how Michigan was recording their votes. There was a clerical error. So here it was. A map of Michigan showed an increase of 130 votes for Joe Biden at the same time that no additional votes were put in for Trump. So as the article says, the screenshot was real, but it was a data entry error. Basically, they just didn't put in the Trump votes yet. So the screenshot looked like all of a sudden 138,000 votes appeared for Joe Biden and none for Donald Trump, which obviously framed that way is going to look bad. So somebody, and I'm not up on the conspiracy theory names out there, but Kuhn, I guess is how you say it. it's a message board. It's this sort of conspiracy theory. I don't even know how to describe it, but basically, took a screenshot of the map and shared it, right? This was at 10:37 on Wednesday night. Less than a half hour later, it was on Twitter. It was posted by this far-right, alt-right account with the weird frog. I don't know what that's about. So in a half hour, it's on Twitter. And basically, long story short, it takes a couple hours before it's being tweeted by the president too. And again, this is not like a political commentary. There's another really fascinating example, and I've linked it on the last slide. This guy, I think his name's Eric Turner, in the previous election, he had like 40 Twitter followers, and he took this picture of buses outside a hotel and placed it with the comment that said that anti-Trump protesters were being bussed in to some rally, which he just made it up, right? This guy had 40 Twitter followers. Anyway, within like 3 days, I think the president was retweeting it as real. Millions of people had looked at this information. The point of kind of thinking about why this matters, and what I'm trying to emphasize, is how quickly these things can go viral. And when they do, we don't, when we see someone in power, or we see someone that we follow or that we respect, this isn't to say Donald Trump didn't know necessarily that this was an error, right? But by the time it gets to these big stages where millions of people are watching, what we fail to realize is that it's not based in fact. There's a couple of quotes that I found that I think really drive home the bigger picture of why spreading fake news matters. Neil Gabler is a researcher who works in this kind of stuff, and he said, "To destroy truth altogether, to set us adrift in a world of belief without facts, a world in which there's no defense against lies." Similarly, Michael Lynch, who teaches philosophy, said the wider problem, and this is kind of, to me, what is so troubling, is that it gets people not to believe real things. There's no way for me to know what's objectively true, so we'll stick to our guns and our own evidence. We'll ignore the facts because nobody knows what's really true anyway. And I feel like I've heard this a lot in conversations, right, in personal circles, where people are like, we've reached this level where there's so much misinformation, there's so much mistrust about everything that you read, that you don't have to interrogate things that you're not comfortable with, right? You can cherry pick. Oh, I'm not comfortable with this information, so I'm going to ignore it. Here's these 3 articles I found that support what I want to say. Or it ends up giving us this sort of just general mistrust that there's any truth out there. And that's, not to be like philosophical, but there is truth out there, right? There's science, there's facts, there's actual events that transpired and happened, right? There is truth out there. But we've become so, as a culture, so mistrustful of the idea of that even existing, that that's really problematic. And finally, I think it's problematic in the way that Bell Hooks describes it here. Part of our contemporary crisis is created by a lack of meaningful access to truth. That is to say, individuals are not just presented untruths, but are told them in a manner that enables most effective communication. When this collective cultural consumption of and attachment to misinformation is coupled with the layers of lying individuals doing their personal lives, our capacity to face reality is severely diminished. And here's the part that really kind of strikes me, and I added this emphasis, as is our will to intervene and change unjust circumstances. So this sort of like cynicism, right? Like we don't know what's true. We can't trust anyone, and so we're not going to do anything, right? This sort of like, I don't even know I can't think of the right word, but the sort of just cynicism of it all, right? And that part that she mentions in the beginning here about having a meaningful access to truth, that to me is what is so, important when we think about our students, is that they don't have, in these ways, they might not have access to truth. They're making decisions, right? Decisions about who they vote for, decisions about who they trust, decisions about their medical health and the medical health of people around them that are not, with their best intentions in mind. And if we feel cynical that we can't know any truth, that there's nothing out there, that anchors us in reality, then how can we make changes? How can we, as the quote says here, how can we intervene and change circumstances in our life if we deny that they're there? If we say like, oh, no, there's no more racism, I don't believe what I read about racism in America, or I don't believe that's true. If we can just sort of cop out like that, then we're not going to be forced to face the reality, right? And to make changes. If we say, nope, pandemic's not real, right? Didn't affect me, I'm not buying it, then we're not facing reality. We're not making choices that make situations better. So my question for you, and we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but why does this matter in a different way, or in a slightly more different, maybe, adding on to that, to our students, many of whom are not native English speakers, right? Many of whom, the statistics show that the biggest population of people duped by fake news are people who are 65 and over. I don't know how many of your students are. But what do we make of this? If fake news is so damaging to our culture as a whole, what do we make? How does it affect people who are not native to the language, who aren't digital natives, who find themselves not only trying to figure out the nuances of English, but now trying to decipher this really dubious, strategically falsified, quote, news? What do you think? Why does this matter to our students?
I think part of it depends on the level of your student. Now, I happen to work with two people that are highly educated, and they come from Russia. So they're used to, obviously, slanted news in the press, lack of freedom. So they relish free press here. Now, as I said, they're more educated, and what I try to work with them on, there are so many controversial topics right now, and you've addressed some of them. I think it's important to get both perspectives, and your source is critical. Now, I still am a newspaper reader, and I look at the New York Times, you get one perspective, in the Wall Street Journal, you get another, but they're both valid sources. And it gives you, I think, an excellent perspective. So whenever we approach a topic, I want them to be aware of both sides. What are both perspectives, and where their sources should be? And I tell them when they read an article, for instance, first, look at what the title of the article is. Yes. Is there something in there already that's going to bias you? Look at your adverbs and adjectives. He spoke loudly, as opposed to he spoke aggressively. Mm-hmm. Aggressively, right away, it sets a tone. So it's, again, these are higher level students, and they can appreciate the nuances, but that's how I personally approach it.
Yeah, I love that, Jean, and I love the idea of showing them, not because one is right and one is wrong, but showing them, like, here's two credible, ways of presenting information. And like, as you said, looking for the nuances and looking for the tone, right? And looking for the sort of narrative that's being told. Not that one is necessarily right and wrong, but being able to sort of pick up on those cues. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things I was thinking about, do your students ever come to you with sort of confusion about the news, or, why does knowing about what's going on in the world matter to our students in ways that might be different for us?
Well, for my students, I have a few students from Brazil and a few from Colombia. Mm-hmm. And they talk about, in their native countries, the elected leaders have been in their positions for quite a long time, and there is only one way. And it was always their understanding and their belief that we still have streets paved with gold here for a lot of people. And so many of them came here, some for work, but many because they thought it would be a freer, more balanced, more fair way of life here. And so when they read things or they hear things that harken back to their native country's style of governance, it distresses a lot of them a lot.
I agree. Yes.
Because, yeah, it's sort of the failing of the American dream for these people who came here to participate and achieve it. Yeah, and you found that too also, Jean?
I found that, it's funny, one of them wrote an essay, and it was when there were protests but some violence occurring. And he talked about the destruction. I mean, we had just finished working on American history, and he saw about the destruction of a statue of Thomas Jefferson. And he was shocked. And he said, this is one of the reasons I left my country. And, you know, that disillusionment is, you know, I mean, it's very difficult. And you try to explain to them, but you're correct. When they see something like that, it's suddenly like, how can this happen in this country?
Yeah, but I think a lot of them feel that they still can make some change here.
Yeah.
And there still is more hope for betterment here and more hope for personal contribution here than in their native countries. But it's very distressing to a lot of them. Very, yeah.
That's a really interesting and I think important perspective. You know, it's sort of like I feel sort of like the jadedness or the disillusion with my country is, you know, I've always kind of felt that way, right? Or we've had enough American history, or we sort of know enough that it's become kind of naturalized, right, for many people to sort of question our country. But to think about, you know, from that perspective of the sort of the disillusionment and the disappointment, it can be really hard to want to believe that, right? To want to believe that here where things are supposed to be more equal and more free, that there are these kinds of issues. That's
particularly because we did not have to give up seeing our cousins and our grandparents in order to be cranky about how things are going on Twitter, right?
Right. I wonder too if in your experience students have felt like an added pressure to know what's going on in the world, right? To like seem educated, to seem like they're on, you know, abreast of things that are going on. In other, when I talked about this before with tutors, people said that sometimes non-native people would think that they had to like protect themselves, right? Like we have to stay up on what's going on in the world, or we have to, you know, believe a certain opinion or be on this page of this political agenda to protect ourselves so that they're not, you know, wanting to get rid of us or something like that. So yeah, I think when we're approaching, you know, or thinking about why fake news matters, I think it matters to us all, and it matters to us as a culture and a country, but there are added considerations that you guys are bringing to the table that impact our students that I think need to go into, you know, how we might address this with them. So the last couple of things that I have for you guys, and maybe we can generate some additional ideas after, but I want to share with you some ideas I had for ways that you might talk about this with students and kind of open up the conversation that this is a thing, or that you could sort of, you know, use it if it comes up when you're working with students as a way of kind of intervening here and kind of making sense of all of this. So here are activities to help students navigate fake news. So one I just wanted to share, and my guess is that I'm able to share with you these slides somehow, right after the presentation. There'll be like a link to them in the Huva site or whatever it's called, however you pronounce it. Yeah, is that something I can do, I think?
I think that's right. I think I've seen them for other.
Yeah, there's a section
groups.
for documents.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I have a both these slides and a handout that I'll post there where you can access all of these links. But here are some great ways that you can fact check stories either for yourself or your students. I like Snopes, they're really thorough. I also am kind of, I trust the BBC a lot because they're not kind of tainted by our politics. Maybe they have their own thing going on, but I tend to like the BBC. I also thought this reverse image search that Google has now is really cool, where you can take an image, because we looked at that infographic about the crime statistics, but you know, the idea of falsified images and videos is a whole subset of fake news that is so insidious and so dangerous because of the, you know, visual things are just so powerful, right, in terms of our human consciousness. So like I said, here's a few of them that I find helpful, that either you can use or you can share with your students. And I'll be sure to post this, all of this, so you can, you know, have all of the links too, if you'd like. So one idea is kind of evaluating home pages. So this is what the home page, and I've borrowed this let's click on it. Oh, so this comes from a pretty cool document put together by the Stanford History Education Group. And basically this is an exercise, and I've linked this on the handout so you could actually print it out and do it with students if you wanted to. But here they took the Slate homepage, and they're basically asking students, they pick out like 3 parts of it, and you're asking students to tell you whether this is an advertisement or not. Because for some people, and especially for people who might not be, you know, native to the language, it can be really difficult to discern an advertisement from information, right? So even just kind of looking at a web page, and it doesn't have to be this one, this is just kind of an example of something that you might talk about with students, you know, understanding like what sponsored content means, right? Or being, you know, when you see save $20, use this code, like realizing this is actually an advertisement for something versus, you know, what the headline of an article might look like. And this would, you know, obviously depend on level of students, but if, you know, this could be a good exercise just to introduce the idea of sort of information versus advertisements, because on a web page, this itself can be really tricky, right? To just kind of navigate what's selling you something and what's actually giving you information. And not that those two are always mutually exclusive, right? But just kind of discerning advertisements from non-advertisements. Another activity could be to look at some news leads. So even just kind of, and this is something that was brought up in a couple different ways, you know, when you look at a news story, regardless of the content, what are some clues that can tell you whether or not this is, you know, put together or created in such a way to get a certain response? So here's an example. Okay, so here's a headline. Syrian government announces truce, plans attack on US. Okay, so, and I'll stop there for a second. Then we have the URL, so it looks kind of legitimate. And this is the beginning, and you can click on the URL. This is the beginning here. The Syrian government announced plans to stop its country's civil war on Friday and attack the United States to take revenge against the US because it supported Syrian rebels for many years. Now, this looks like a news article, right? It has the sort of format. This CNN.com.co looks pretty legit, right? For maybe a less discerning eye. Anybody want to say anything about this?
Is it from Colorado? I don't know. What's .co? It looks like a school in Colorado.
Yeah, so this is something I learned in learning more about kind of fake news in general, but this is a really common thing in websites that are trying to look legitimate that'll have this .co after. And so like CNN.com is something we would recognize as legitimate. I don't know why it's taking so long to load on my screen. Maybe, I don't know why. Oh, it can't be reached. It took too long to respond. If you were able to look at this site, you would see that it's not legitimate. But there are other cues here as well. An attack on the US, right? This seems pretty outrageous. It seems pretty, you know, if it's getting a big reaction, there's probably a reason for that. So we can also help our students to recognize, not that we have to become experts on every domain name, of course, but if we can recognize some patterns. Here, by contrast, is sort of real article, right? Syrian government announces truce backed by Russia and Turkey. So like a lot less inflammatory. We can see it comes from the NewYorkTimes.com. It has actual authors and a date. We can help our students to see that a lot of times fake news doesn't have a real author attached to it, might not have a legitimate date. I don't know if you noticed this, but that article that I showed you about the coronavirus being a biological warfare, was dated like January of 2020.
2020, yeah.
Yeah, which, and I didn't look into that, but to me seems super weird, right? Because all of the information covered in the article would have to have happened long after that date, or months, you know, at least several months after. So even helping our students to look for an author, look for a date beyond looking at the URL, look for, not to say that just because a headline is, you know, saying something, you know, because there's something going on, that it's false, but notice the sort of like inflammatoriness of the first one. Note that there's like a location, but even the tone of this, as someone was pointing out earlier, a ceasefire agreement between Syria's government and weakened rebel forces have been trying to topple its schedule to start on Friday, a turning point in this conflict. There's no like emotion here, right? There's no bias involved.
Well, the thing that's sad about this is that comparing this to Twitter, my student would not be able to read 90% of the words in there, whereas she could read a tweet.
Right. Yeah. So that's good too. And I have a couple places where we might go for news stories that are a little bit more manageable for English language learners. Good. Yes. Great point, Peggy. Thank you. Which brings me to my helpful handout here. So this is something that I'll include as a PDF in the documents, but I'll also click on it here so that you can see it. And maybe if I close some of these, it will make things load faster. I thought as I was, this is just a side note as this is loading, but as I was clicking on all of these fake news stories, I thought to myself, I'm probably going to start to get advertisements, and they were all kinds of wild conspiracy theories now. The internet probably thinks I'm like a crazy person. Okay. So here are a couple options, and again, you can feel free to take note now, but you'll have access to this. A couple of places where you can read some news stories with students that might be more manageable depending on their reading level. So Newser is a good one. If you've never seen it before, you should be able to click on this link. It gives short summaries in visually engaging formats. So if we just click on, for instance, this first one, which I haven't done before, they're going to be pretty short summaries. They have some visuals. A bunch of annoying ads coming in, but they look a little bit shorter than maybe something that you would read in a longer article. That one's not my favorite. News in Levels and Smithsonian's Tween Tribune, they have current event articles that you can pick multiple reading levels of complexity depending on someone's proficiency in English, which I think can be really helpful. It can also be, you know, you can use news articles as ways of learning new words, right? Not just, and kind of in the process, you could also be talking about what makes for legitimate news and what doesn't, kind of thing. One that I really like, if you've never seen it before, is Learning English from the Voice of America. And what I like about this are these are news stories that are specifically designed to help students learn more words. So for instance, there was an article I clicked on earlier that I thought was useful. Oh, so here's an article about Biden opening a global summit on climate. There's an audio version, so you can listen to it, which can be really helpful. It's 7 minutes long, so it's not super long. We have nice short paragraphs, and then there's like vocab words that are highlighted and then explained at the bottom. So this might be, you know, I'm not as proficient with different levels of reading, but I thought this was really cool where you could sort of, this might be manageable and allow students to, you know, learn some more vocabulary words. But for things maybe where you were working with different levels, news and levels, and this one are really good as well. I also found this, this is just a kind of one-page, kind of like a checklist. I'm a little bit, I guess, suspicious of checklists as like ways of helping students understand information literacy, because to me it's sort of like more complicated and nuanced than checking off a list. But here are some things that you could, you know, conceivably print out and go over with students, or just include in your own conversation about the news. But things to look for, right? Like if everything's in all caps, if there's a lot of pop-ups and banner ads, Here's that .co thing that I was talking about before. Telling students to click on the About page to follow links. So even though I'm sort of like cynical of checklists, this is a really good list of things to look for that will often help you identify if something's actually fake news. And then the last thing is that little worksheet that I showed you, which you don't have to use this exact one, but this is just an example of how you might take a look at some web pages and have students kind of at least discern between advertisements and kind of, you know, non-advertisements. So finally, I wanted to leave a little bit of space to see if we had questions or if we had other ideas on how we might bring this to students. There is a slide where you can see references where I got information, which will be available to you as well. And I just wanted to end on this quote, which I just thought was so powerful and scary at the same time. This comes from a forensic pathologist on this BBC series. Now I feel like I work for the BBC or something. Now I'm just like promoted. And I've never seen this series, but it sounds really cool. But the quote was, "The opposite of truth is not just a lie. The opposite of truth is chaos." And I think, you know, to me, that's the real issue here, right? Is being able to give ourselves and our students the opportunity to make good decisions, right, in their lives. Be able to give them the resources in terms of their news literacy that they can make those decisions in an informed way, that they're not deceived by these lies, right? Because when there is no truth, it's not just that we have lies, but that we can, you know, descend into chaos where nothing is true and nothing can be believed. So I think we do have about 15 minutes left. Do people have ideas for things we could do with our students, or just overall questions or comments?
There is a, they call it the kids version of the New York Times that comes out with the print edition on Sundays.
Okay.
It's not every week, I don't know, maybe every month. And the level is pretty good, and it's not all childish. There are articles on real topics, and so that might be something for a lower reading level.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And there's all, I'm sorry.
I was going to mention another website where you can get good articles that come from the Washington Post, the Times, Newsela, Newsela.
I've heard of that one. Yeah, thank you. That's
It's
great.
very good.
That's great, Gail. Thank you.
Is that a .com or a .org?
Newsela. Let me look. I've got it. I go to it all the time. Yeah, newsela.com. Newsela.com.
Okay, thanks.
I use it a lot with my conversation group.
I'm just now seeing the chat. I couldn't see it when I was presenting the slides, but someone commented. Marcia commented that students see memes and take those as real news. And that's a kind of newer phenomenon that I find, you know, is not just true of, you know, at my Rowan University students are the same way, right? And part of it, I think, is this sort of like, I don't know the right verb here, so I'm going to make up one, like the smallizing of news, right? Or like get our information from, like, instead of reading, the thought of reading a whole paper article, right? Like in the Inquirer or something is like foreign to many students, right? And I'm thinking about college students, but all kinds of students. So, you know, we're used now to getting our news in these very small snippets. That's something we see as a meme, a picture with a couple of words on it, we take as reality, or we take as, quote, news. And anybody can put these together, right? It's if I can do it, which I can, surprisingly, then anyone can, right? That you could put an image with, you know, some, quote, facts and package it as news. So I don't know if we'll have really time to address what to do about that, but I know that there are, you know, scholars who work on just even that, right? Like the memes and the sort of strategy that goes into them, and how, you know, increasingly, because people use more and more social media too, like that's clickable, right? That's shareable. A whole article about, you know, the complex nuances of a global pandemic is not attractive to people, right? Nobody wants to read that. But if you can give me this short little meme with a picture and a, quote statistic, oh, that's something I can, share really easily, and I don't have to think about it and all that kind of stuff. So we didn't talk too much about the idea of memes, but I think that that's a great point, Marcia, and just kind of remembering too that the ways that our students get news and the way that people around them get news, that matters too, right? Because they're kind of sharing it, is not just digital, but that the formats are constantly evolving. And to me, it seems like they're getting more and more compact and concise. And in some ways that can be a nice thing, but it doesn't, a meme doesn't have sources usually, right? Or links or ways of following up on it. So they can, being aware of the potential dangers of taking that as, a fact is really important as well. Yeah, other thoughts to share before we go for today?
I found this very useful and very interesting. I thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Gail. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm sort of like, this, like I said, this is not my area of expertise per se. My PhD is in English literature, which has literally nothing to do with this. It's century British literature. Fun fact, William Shakespeare's birthday today.
Yes.
And the day he died, it was the same day. Oh, not the, the same. But once, I do, like I said, I do talk with college students about digital literacy all the time. And the more I learn about fake news and, and see the effects of it in our own world, the more I'm just sort of convinced that this is something we need to talk more about and be aware of and really sort of, share and talk with as many people as we can, because, as a lot of the articles that we looked at, and as you guys talked about in your experience with your students, it can be like a life or death thing, right? Is our access to information determines the decisions that we make for us and our families. So allowing students to have the tools to discern real information from information that's meant to deceive them can really allow them to make better decisions for them and their families. So I thank you all so much for being here. Yes,
can you link your what's it called?
Yes.
Can you link what you just showed us?
Yes, so I'm gonna, in the chat box right now, I'm gonna put both my slides and that handout I showed. But I'm also going to link them more permanently on the Hoovas. I feel like I'm saying that wrong, but they'll be there as well. So they'll be kind of more permanent. So there are the slides, and everything kind of has a link attached to it. So if you wanted to read more about something there, you should be able to. And let me put the handout in this one. All right. Okay. Again, thank you all so much for being.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your insight.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I have the evaluation link in the chat box as well. If you all can please fill that out.
And Jennifer, thank you so much, because it was very helpful for immigrant people like me, because we are more vulnerable.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad you liked it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The link, I didn't get the link.
No.
I'm not seeing
Neither link.
the link for your slides. We got the link for the evaluation.
Oh, I think you sent it to me only, Jennifer.
I did. Okay. So
No,
in the
I didn't get it either.
meeting, I was saying I always feel very accomplished if I learn something about Zoom. So there I go, learning something right in front of people. It's always the best thing. You still learn things.